So the anatomy of a card with the perspective of Oxel, the the kind of a game or game in quotation marks that we've been processing, uh, towards to have a start of this and not to turn this into a monologue. I just want to point out a couple of different areas and put them on a table as material. Uh, and though these areas are mostly towards the sort of intriguing different branching systemic qualities that are present in cards. And then I want to kind of highlight that there is system-wise, cards are extremely complex, uh, but they have a much lighter feeling in terms of their use compared to the systematic complexity that they often carry, which is an interesting quality itself. And I also want to highlight that everything said here about cards doesn't necessarily have to mean cards literally. It can mean anything close to cards, but also other things in terms of structure. And then highlight also that there is this possibility of using these structures as cards or something close to cards uh, as a kind of medium for creating organization, like almost like a moment of organizing or um, a unit of organization as well. But to start off with this short list, like first of all, the card itself. Um, if we want to put a concept on this, like in a traditional sense, we could say that the card is like a concrete sense of a frame. Like it's probably something that is concrete, that is closest to the abstract sense of a frame uh, among amongst our different forms. I mean, there is things that can come to the same level. We can think of art for examples as well, paintings, etc. But there is this sense like that there is the frame around the card, and the card seems to be a creation of card seems to be very aware of that it's using a frame-like idea in itself. But the one additional thing on this level of the frame, the surrounding, I would say that the cards are maybe not equally, but close to, if it's not equal, interested in both inside the frame and outside the frame. And we'll come to that in a moment. But inside the frame, there is a range of interesting qualities. First of all, um, uh, there are these systemic elements, like areas. Uh, let me, yes, let me pick something like this. I mean, which is a Magic the Gathering card, but doesn't really matter that it's Magic the Gathering. It's just an example that. So here we can see um, a name, of course, part of a system, but then a number which relates and creates this sort of network point where the card goes outside of itself into a system. Like here, the one means amount of mana it will be cast, but more maybe of general interest is just this possibility that the card actually kind of creates this almost like thread work as a network of that runs from this card to all the other cards, or maybe some of the cards only. Not all of these systems necessarily come to all the cards. But there can also be systems that are even within individual cards or groups of cards themselves. But then secondly, there is interesting interplay between systems and kind of a diagrammatization that is like these areas are actually meaningful in a magic card. I think I have another, okay, here, which is a more structured, like that the names are always in the same place. The costs of magic, which is at the top left, is in the same place. What's in the middle, the creature, is a type, there are other symbols there, which is another typing quality. I think it's a type of a card, and then there is this almost like a contour or scope of rules that relates to the card itself. So the card in itself becomes this almost like a private range of interaction, which of course doesn't affect only itself. It affects the when it lands to the table. This is slightly already pointing out outside the frame um, systems, but we can go there in a moment. But like whatever is said in the card, um, like it's like referring to itself what it can do, but it's doing things outside of itself. Like here it says, look at the top 3 cards in your library and put them back in any order, and then uh, as one option, and then another option, draw a card, then put the Sensei's Divining Top, which is this card, on top of its owner's library. Um, um, but this not to go into the specifics of magic again, but just pointing out how this um, uh, system in itself, first of all, kind of creates this sort of diagrammatics, which is one system, then creates internal systems, but then those internal systems also refer to external systems in a rather complex way. But then beyond this, inside, of course, we have cards as spreads, which is outside the frame, but system that they take part in, like spreads of tarot cards. But then we also have like different systems of tables, like a particular game might play cards in a row. Like, to use a normal example, maybe solitaire has a system how the table works, and that's what the cards interact with. And it almost, in solitaire, the table almost becomes this machine, is that the cards are looking for a socket that they can connect to. Like in terms of numbers, they can socket themselves in chains of numbers. So the table is a machine. But that's not the only external system, because of course there's the system of the hand, like how many cards you have in your hand, when do you get more cards, when you get less cards, or how are cards removed. And then there's the system of moves, like how do you play these cards from your hand. And then there is the system of the deck, which is like of course traditional card deck has only one deck, but many board games have multiple decks that function differently. And one can think of even other possibilities, but the thematic for these outside the frame systems is that they all create different distributions and operations, but in rather different qualities. Like the deck answers to a certain range of possibilities, the hand answers to another range of possibilities, which is almost like creates this player, like what does the player have at hand, literally. And then the table answers another range of possibilities, which is something that all these inside and the diagrammatics and the systems within those diagrammatics interplay with. So to summarize, do say.
Yeah, just question. So when you say table, would you say you are using it as a synonym to a board, or is it a bit different concept?
It is a board, definitely. I was just using it in the, like normally in card games, it's a table, so I use the most common term, so to speak. But in terms of ourselves, it's very much a board. But it's often a board built out of the cards. That the cards are the composition. that create the table. So in a way, the table in card games is often a board in composition, but can also be a mix, that there is something in the board that is always there and other parts of the board that keep on being removed and placed again and things like this. So that's the kind of, like, in rough sense, a structural or systematic palette. And I wanted to highlight this whole range of possibilities that we relatively easily put in this little thing called card. And of course, this is not to mention things like tarot cards that have a whole nother, still a diagrammatic, but a whole nother sense of system, which is more interpretation, figure, or reading as a possibility. But all of that essentially, that's what I wanted to bring to the metaphorical table in front of us, and maybe open the topic as, like, if one looks at the sort of anatomy of a card, a general card of these different architectures, what could one do with such possibilities? And open that as a general question, but I'll open the conversation to really any comments. And I maybe to Martin's comment, this cross section, that is a really interesting way of thinking about it. Yeah, I agree that it's a cross section of systems, and it's a cross section of even its own diagrammatics. And it's like an architectural cross section, that there is a system how it is cross sectional.
I think a funny thing as you speak about it with the card is that it's in this sense, in this cross-sectional sense, it is kind of, and if you take my second comment also to it, and you said something rather related earlier also, that it is in this sense, it can be seen as a kind of almost exhaustive, kind of prismatic capturing of its own kind of embedded structure, or like the structure in which it is kind of embedded or a part of, at the same time as it has this curious kind of boundary of absence and presence, which is kind of arbitrary. So it's in a funny way, it's very complete and not complete, kind of onto itself.
Yeah, and that is actually a very good point, the second point, in this sense, because you could even say that cards have their own management, or, to be French about it, maintenance of present. But they almost like create a different opinion of what present is, because like cards can have, like you said, it's actually very true that for many games, like the cards being able to be removed from the table or put on the table kind of functions like presence. But then on top of that, you have like cards that are active, that are passive, and then you have cards at hand, which is like not present, but more potential. Like if the present is more actual, but the cards at hand are in this liminal state of potential, that they are much more closer to be present than the cards on the deck, but still not present.
That's again a bit of a perspective thing, because for the one holding them and seeing them, they're rather quite actual, and for the other ones, they're really, like, I don't know, subliminal, very, very deeply. I mean, they see that there's a number of them, but like not which ones they may be.
Maybe perhaps like I kind of agree with you if one takes the perspective that the cards that are at hand are kind of like a metaphor of something being internally present. Like
or partially, or like selectively, or how to say, not selectively in that case, but like partially, I guess, no?
Yeah, partially, but also you could think of it this way. Like if I make a concrete metaphor, is like, let's say there are several people in a conversation. Um, the cards at hand are kind of an allegory of what is very internally present with those people, like the thoughts they are having. Whereas, let's say, things that are in the environment of the conversation or the words said out loud even are more like the things that are on the table. So in a way, like cards have built this sort of allegorical internal world, external world, the hand being kind of the internal world of your thoughts and what are you considering, and then the table board is the external world, which is interesting in itself, how close it kind of maps to that.
On the other hand, sorry, just to pile up on this, on the other hand, in spoken language, the thoughts, if we speak of thoughts spoken in words, spoken through voice, they kind of resonate only for a very short time, and then they might kind of continue existing because other thoughts are built upon them. Whereas with cards, there's also different kind of possibilities for this, like because like then they might lay, continue laying on the table, on the board, or they might get covered with something else.
Yes, also
so there's also there's different modes of being then present, or like stopping to be present. So like, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, this is sort of what I was referring, that there, even on the table, there is actually modes, like something is active or passive, but also combined. Like magic cards, particularly, for example, use this, like that some of the cards actually go behind, but are still visible of another card, meaning it might be like a person holding an item, which is another card. And like create this kind of combinations, coverings, and then you have like things like in reserve, active, exhausted, like the card on the back row, card on the front row, the card that has been turned to the side, being often exhausted, which is like all these kind of logics playing together, which is always kind of made into this sort of very flexible cross-section of systematics by being able to combine from the inside of the card to the outside of the card to the table to the deck, etc. Any comments, Jakob? Because I monologue enough. Now I'm awkwardly trying to open the conversation.
So for me, what was coming through my mind when also Martin mentioned that there is possible, like, let's say affordance is like that the card can be covered or stacked on each other, or like put in some patterns, like that you can put another, well, that's not what you were saying, but like I'm kind of following up, so that you can put another card adjacent to one card, or perhaps I'm imagining that in some weird games you could actually take the card and flip it and kind of put it vertically. So that's different kinds of possible relations that you can construct with the cards. And what I was thinking of was that actually, if I were to express those in some simple way, and it kind of brought me to promise theory, because then I would be like decomposing. So let's say I would take the agent or super agent of the card, which would have kind of partial agents like the card edge, which would have promises to be able to accept some card vertically, horizontally, or there would be card surface as like promising to accept or receive the card like vertically, and suddenly we are like constructing this network of possible relations,
Mm.
which in Mark Burgess terms would be some very specific structured space-time, right? Which is defined by the network of the promises and possible acceptances of the promises. So yeah, so that was me just musing, like, how would this look like? This what we are describing, the set of rules and cards and their possible relations. How would it look like formulated within the promise theory or semantic spacetime? But it's just like my internal exercise, and I still do not. I'm not well versed enough in those things to be productively using it. So yeah, my thoughts.
I think that's that area in itself, like also in terms of structural population, is interesting. Of course, like one example from there is the structure of dominoes, which are tiles, not cards. But like I said, like the cards and their functioning are not just cards. It's more interesting is really this sort of possibility of ranges. And dominoes are very close to cards in itself. But dominoes being laid up on this sort of a growing network, which then has rules of how it grows, is an example of kind of the direction you're talking about. Um, and of course, in dominoes, it's simple. It's like connecting, matching amount of pips, numbers essentially. But then, like a wholly different system is like if you have like a board as a layout where you have slots for cards, and you have to place like select a card you place in this slot, select a card you place in that slot, and that's another way of networking in itself. Like as well. But I do say,
Yeah, just one thing, like kind of we spoke already about this kind of presence absence type of thing, and I'm kind of a bit spinning around that right now. I think it's rather curious because if we compare again with language or so, there is very few ways in which, and it's sometimes it can be really difficult to kind of remove things from a conversation once they have been said, right?
yeah.
So there's this kind of, so you say something and you choose the wrong word, and then you're like, actually, rather I should say da 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 da, and then you can kind of try to somewhat erase what just happened and kind of replace it with a better word. Sometimes that can work. It depends also on, I think, maybe the kind of atmosphere of the conversation and what's the attitude of the conversation partners and so. But somehow I think with cards, they have the modularity is rather strong. Or like sorry, I'm mixing up stuff. What I'm saying is that a card, if you kind of inject it into a game, let's say you make a pre-selection of so and so many cards that will then be the game, and then it kind of flows in that game and it becomes present and so, and then in the next game it's not there, or you take it out of that first game in one way or another, it can actually be deactivated, right? It can really kind of remove itself from this kind of symphony of, what is the possibility space right now. Then I think is like, first of all, do you agree with me there? This, and second, like, I agree with myself. I find that a rather kind of curious possibility that like it's such a rich kind of content-rich. There are such content-rich elements like that form all sorts of action possibilities, but then you take them out and you don't miss them, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, and which is kind of much more, what's the right word? Not mobile, but much more, detachable, movable than what.
It has a very kind of almost like there's a kind of, even if we speak about actual physical cards, it has almost a kind of immaterial feature to it. It leaves no echo, it leaves no footprint. It can, like, because I don't know, we interact with cards maybe in this way that once they're gone, the reality space kind of has just been changed. So, and now it's again only what we look at.
And it's also one of the qualities that kind of plays with this, which also could be mentioned or worthy of mentioning, is the cards also play very flexibly with what one could call randomness, or maybe more aptly stochastics, versus designated. Because you can have a situation that, okay, now we take these three cards and then we pick one of them blindly, or we shuffle the whole deck, so to speak. So now we get random, but random within the cards that are in the deck, or we shuffle the hand and then we get random, but random only from the members of the deck. But of course, one can also say like not random, like it will be this card after this card after this card. So they don't play, actually they kind of do away with this sort of binary of random versus designated, but actually create the whole range between that and open the possibilities of playing with one of these two, um, not knowing which two, exactly these two, or any kind of variation in that range. Which is another like quality where they show interesting flexibility, structural flexibility that is often not even talked about in culture, because often people kind of, almost like in a binary way say random or not random, but cards are actually kind of challenging that from the get-go, the limitation of that. But I wanted to open one general question, but before that, I'll make one example, which is like different enough to maybe useful to highlight, which is this card on the screen, which is from a deck called Game Master's Apprentice. Now, what is interesting about this is that once again we see this heavy diagrammatics of that create this sort of possibility of a system, but but the interesting quality here is what the system is actually pointing to or designated to, and like these cards are generative by nature, so they could be used for somebody writing a story, or of course running an RPG, but they're used in this manner that they are picked once again randomly or stochastically, and then like for example in the middle you see on the middle left side there is like symbols of an ear and an eye and a finger, which is touching, and a nose, and then randomly you get like here, if you're looking for the sound, you might get angry whispering as it's in the card. Or if you think of what you see, there is a lazily spinning wheel. But this is generative in the sense that there is no specific system that this goes to. Rather, it wants to be this card that can latch onto any kind of other ground to generate other things. And that goes through the whole card in itself, like there is the belongings, there are names that are random, there is a random catalyst, random location, random vice, and random virtue.
Are you saying metaverse?
Maybe something larger than metaverse. Like it's more like that they can enter any scene or board to bring in an aspect which the card is creating a system for, that things can be asked from that aspect that is coming in. Like, for example, one can ask that it's a sound, or one can ask that it's a particular item. Like now it was sheet music or archive of personal compositions, as it's in this particular card. And I find this interesting in the sense that there is a system that is in the card, but it's towards generation. It's not locked into a constellation of a particular game, but actually kind of like a modular unit to be plugged into other scenes, and then by the judgment of whoever uses it, utilized to generate something. So like this possibility of cards also be generative is there. Of course, it's also present in tarot as well, um, but can take other forms like this. But on top of this all, the one general thing I wanted to emphasize is that, I mean, in the design of games, it's often known, or a kind of considered good practice, I guess, is that if there is a system that people already know in the real world, whether it's walking on the street or something like cards, and you can refer to that system, it makes everything lighter to implement. If they have to build a completely new system into themselves, you're asking much more from the people. And if one then takes these cards and opens that up to, well, they don't have to be cards per se, but they can be, say, a page, or they can even be an environment, a scene, an area. But you could treat those like cards. That opens this possibility of adopting or loaning from all these systems by just saying to people, it's just like cards. Like, okay, this area or this particular field in a backyard is like area that sets up the generation of senses, and this particular area is like a symbolic area, whatever one does. But it's kind of allowing this sort of adoption of a system that generally should make the using of the system a lighter possibility. So by my sense, there is a possibility of using this sort of structure, this framework that the card provides in this all this vastness of possibilities, as a way to make some of the complicated systems easier to bring in to operate.
Can we just quickly stick a bit on that point there? Because I'm not sure if I got exactly what you were pointing at. So was it so that you said that once one has a bit understood what a card is, or one has a bit experience with handling cards and a bit familiarized oneself with their elements and functionalities and so stuff, that one could kind of take this kind of structural, well, it's not a metaphor, but kind of type in a way, and say that, okay, now another thing that I find, I can take that to function like a card. Is that what you said?
Yeah, essentially, like, and also like that the culture already contains a moderate amount, or like let's say a useful amount of this kind of understanding. Not, of course, everybody has played with all kinds of cards, but it's still like way more than nothing. The understanding that is already there. So you can tap into that understanding already from the get-go.
That understanding of what a card can do, what a
Yeah.
card is, in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
So and that again, once again, enables that one can,
like, rather than trying to build a completely new system, you're adopting system qualities. Like, when you say it's just like this can be, yes, a description, but it can also function as a system that, like the example of the backyard explained in card areas and telling how they work, allows people to rely to a certain extent upon the system that they already have, if they know cards and have a general sense of cards. And therefore they don't have to start from the scratch of building the system. They can get like a leg up on getting to the systematics, and therefore the systems become lighter to operate.
and is that so? Without even going into how that would function, because I think that's another question. A second question first. Is that then something that, in your opinion, is specific to the card, or that the card is particularly suited for compared to other things like paragraphs from a text, or I don't know.
I think like this is kind of why the introduction part is to point out the sort of multitude of systems, which is rather vast. Now, if you take a comparison paragraph, like in a way, you could say there are so many systems to a paragraph in terms of how language functions, but there is a kind of muddiness to that. Like in some ways, paragraph is actually a very almost like a primitive system. That primitive system makes it moldable. Like you can put a lot of things there. Of course, inside of it, it has the systems of sentences, and those are
It
also
was
very.
also maybe not the best example. Maybe one can try and find another example. I was looking for, I was trying to test the specificity or the specific suitability of the card compared to other possible structural types of helping one build a new kind of logic through using via other things that one finds, right? Because that's what we're talking about at this very second.
Yeah.
So I mean, we had so we could I mean the thing with the card also, because we're looking at one right now, and we've been looking at others, it's also that they are not like, it's not like an archetype or anything. It's a rather intentionally and delicately and intricately designed and composed structural component or suggestion in a way, which kind of lifts itself by way of this to be potentially usable in the way that you say. But I mean, not all cards are like this. You look at a Uno card, for example, or like a pick 3, like 3 of clubs, or what is it called? So we speak about something rather specific. No, it's not like a general type that would per se kind of offer these types of things. It's a specific type of card.
Well, I would say it's a framework or a meta framework. Like even the Uno card, like Uno card is just simple, but it still has like a central action. Let me see, I don't have an Uno card, but like I can use the flux cards. Like the Uno card has like a suite which forms a network that connects multiple cards together, and then it has the specific internal, this is the action of this card, and which is a common framework structure for cards. Like in some ways, like a card, like a magic card, actually is a more complicated version, but owes a lot to that framework. Like for example, rather than having like static suits, the magic cards have the 5 magic colors. Like we can see on the top right, like there's 2 skulls and then a number 2. What it actually means that there is like to use this card, you need 2 black mana and 2 whatever mana, which is kind of like its take on suits in a more dynamic sense. And then similarly, like you have this sort of what is the action of the card itself. So actually, it's not like too far from Uno, but I'm not challenging your sense that the card, every card or for every game, the making of the card, the composition of a card is a kind of a thing of its own. But the kind of whole culture of creating cards do share frameworks. Like this sort of sense of diagramming, like these sort of systems that are specific to the card and systems that go beyond the cards. And of course, beyond that, there are cultural practices like the hand and like the deck, whether they are multiple or not. Like So it's not patternless. It actually has multiple patterns that, while they are varied, they are still similar. To Jakob's, before his laptop dies, like
Quick fix it, Jakob.
yeah, like card like a book, yes. Card like a page, yes. Real like environment like a card, yes. All of those are possibilities, and even to the sense that one doesn't have to hold to the card too strictly either. It's merely like this sort of possibility of intricate systems that opens up from the card. And certainly I'm not saying solely staying in the card, but more like if one looks for rich sources of both kind of the systematics, but also sources that people might have easier time of adopting, not like superfluous, but still easier. Cards are a good source for that. And I do think like several things that we have said, including your rather observant take on the presence, kind of periphery, or external presence, internal presence, um, potential of the deck. All of these are areas where cards have interesting takes that are surprisingly close to real life, but then create a more structural, systematic version of it, which is an interesting kind of allegorical existence that cards have towards our normal situations as well.
Yeah. And I think, to me, I think it's just the two of us now. Huh?
Yeah.
I think, to me, this where I see the charm. I mean, obviously, it seems it appears really potent, this kind of internal unfolding, or unfolding out of their own internal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That cards kind of afford. That I think is kind of basically very interesting. And the other thing that I'm really charmed by is like the way where they really come close to my old darling, the layer filters, filter layers.
Yes.
Because this kind of being in, being out, like being there, not being there, testing. So like you get to a very, they allow for a very kind of compositional approach to things. Like, so now it's in, what happens? Now it's not in, what happens? And this is where I think this kind of, not only the possibility or the potential or the capacity for presence that they have, but also the capacity for absence again that they have, due to their kind of disconnectedness. And just maybe as a side note, we do speak about physical or like properties that root in physicality to some extent also. Not to some extent, but
yeah, it's like, for me, like ultimately it's, let's say, the card framework or meta framework, however one wants to think about it, is first of all, it's an instrument of, well, not just thinking, certainly thinking, processing, but also composing. And for example, to take your now it's present, now it's absent, which is so very much because cards and layer filters are very closely related to each other. But then also cards have this sort of, now it's next to, and now it's on top of, now it's half covering or not, and these can have different meanings. So for example, if a backyard would be taken as a card, then close by there is a suggestion that the card could be taken off and another card placed on it, or a card could be placed on top of it, then those two cards are combined, which is a maybe useful way of thinking of how to change things.
So, and this is the thing. Yeah, this is the thing where I think I would like to spend a second more now.
Yes.
In this moment, the situation that you're describing here, are you imagining that we sit at a kind of table, let's say, and we imagine a type of backyard that could be added to some whatever the scenery is that we're kind of there busy with, and we think of it, or maybe we draw it on like a card type piece of cardboard or what, and then we put it in and we put it out? Or do you imagine this to be kind of standing on the second floor balcony of a flat looking out into the backyard and saying, that backyard I can imagine like a card, and then I can take it away, or I can add, or I can put another, because like there's rather kind of different physics embedded with this. So I'm just like, right now I'm only asking, what is it that you have in mind when you verbalize that scene?
In a way, both, but maybe more the latter. Like
Right.
in the sense, like this is the card that is not necessarily a card point, as in the beginning was kind of emphasizing that.
So
like,
we look. So let me just continue. Like,
yeah,
if I may.
yeah, sure.
Like, so we look at a moment where we walk like through a city. Let's say Helsinki down the street or whatever, and then we see a house, and we say, this house could be like this is this card now.
Mm.
And then we start kind of thinking about. So, but basically, what we're then doing, and correct me, like if or like comment on, of course, on if you have other imaginations there. Then we're building, wouldn't we? Kind of a second layer, kind of between us and that house.
Yes.
Because of course, physically we cannot exchange it, but we could imagine that it would be exchanged.
Yes. And you could even imagine that you're walking around the city and then you see some place and then you pull from your back pocket, but maybe metaphorically, a card. Maybe it's a card that you have written somewhere, but it's not necessarily a physical card. And then you lay it over that scene, and then it's almost like putting a card on the table, on the board.
So see, that I think is the much easier case. That I can imagine. That is like then I have then the kind of the stuff that is with me in that situation is what it is, and I can kind of course, as soon as I add the card, be it a card or a handkerchief printed as we, I can kind of conjure up its connectivity with that new element. That to me is much easier. But like, I think there's a trickery which I find also rather intriguing, even though I don't know exactly how to think of it, is that when I say, so that thing is now a card, and then I make this kind of copy, kind of virtual copy, so to speak, in my head of the scenery that I move in, and I say, but now I throw another card at it. Or in place of it, so to speak. So like I'm looking at a cabinet right now, and I just say, okay, that cabinet is now this and this card, and I take it out of off of the table, and I throw another card at it.
Yeah.
Not sure that that's what you meant, but like I'm just going through whatever's happening in my head now.
No, this is a great point, and because I thought about this, and there is a way to make it easier, because what you described is hard because it's not a card. But this is kind of why I pointed this diagrammatization and how each area works in different way. Because if one thinks of what is the card as practice, like let's say you're looking at, well, I don't see what you're looking at, but let's say we're looking at a room. To make it into a card, it's not just seeing it as a card, but it's more a practice. Okay, which is the description area? Which is the suite? Which is the, it's too hard, but we can use this like a general example. It's like this practice of like actually almost like drawing the card in. It's like, okay, I think that the suite is actually that cup there. And then what do we use for symbols and what do we use for description? Like that practice in itself is kind of composing the card. So the card doesn't just become by seeing it, but it's actually the composition that you kind of, in a way, metaphorically draw over with an invisible ink.
Okay, so hang on. Now we have a compatibility problem between the way that you look at this and the way that I look at it. I need to just quickly plug in my charger, because otherwise you will be alone in this call after everybody drops.
The damnation of batteries. Yes.
One second. Oh my God. So the connectivity here. Hang on, I need to fix
Yes.
this.
No worries.
I hope this makes for an interesting intermezzo for those for those few souls who will be watching this. When I think card, like even from the beginning of this session here, the main point that captures me is their physical composition as being independent of stuff, having an edge, and then I add what you begin in the what you said in the beginning, their internal kind of suggestion or complexity. Yeah. And so those are the things, and then the kind of fact that they can be mixed, taken on, laid off. So I've been talking about this a bit more. If I get you right, what you just said is that you look at them as a kind of almost typology of graphical layout and positioning of elements, each of which represent systems of some sort in a specific way, and of a kind of like almost like a visual mapping.
It's just, I think it's a one pathway to think like that, to make visible the practice that cards become when they're actually used. Because even when you're seeing cards in a game, it's actually the practice of interpreting it, which is then guided by this sort of almost diagrammatic placement of relations. Like, it's not an accident that like suits are always in the same place. They follow systems in and of themselves. They're guides for practice. So, but the important thing here is the practice in itself. It's just that diagrammatic aspect is a part of a way to get to that practice itself.
If you say diagrammatic, do you mean graphic? Graphic.
I mean diagrammatic in a kind of loose academic sense of
visualized.
Not just visualized, but visual presentation of a system, which is roughly the diagrammatic sense of it.
Right. So, okay, because like my exercise in my head is to is a can a ball be a card? And to some sense, it can. I mean, yes. it has the very easy kind of match with being a detached object of a certain, weight, and that can be added to a scene and taken away from a scene.
Yeah.
Can a smell be a card? Or can shared histories be a card if I'm together with my brother? Like the fact that, we grew up in the same house, for example, can that be taken to be a card?
Or be made into a card. I think it's always
that's where exactly same word. Yes. So this is where I'm kind of thinking, like, how can I, if we think about how to kind of imagine organizations, let's say any group or company or program or whatever stuff, and we want to kind of utilize the kind of affordances of cards, the many of which we have now spoken,
Mhm.
then I think what makes this kind of applicable or kind of potent in terms of imagining organizations is then like, how can I kind of more than conceive of these and these elements as cards, but actually use them like cards, because then
Yeah.
the card idea gives me the capacity, like the imaginative capacity, to play with that structure that I'm imagining in using the benefit of their affordances.
Yeah, because like if you compare a card to a painting, it very much more strongly kind of behaves like an instruction. It's like the question, how do I work to like it entails practice and a system of practice. Like
The
that's
card does more than the painting.
yes. Like of course painting
But that's kind of conventional, right? That's consensual that it does so. We've agreed that it does that.
But it's interesting in this sense of actually kind of bringing this sort of systemic insistence, but then opening up to maybe how the practice of the system can be made in many ways, um, and then like that's also an interesting comparison between a traditional image like a photograph and a card is once again this insistence of a system that is in the card itself, but then quite open or quite flexible in terms of what that system is.
So we now kind of said, or you did, that we can take the cards as and like also what I said with the cross section, like it's kind of, so you said diagramming, I said cross section. So we take what is on the card, the different kind of visual elements that it shows, as kind of being, so to speak, like if you cut from a salami, or like this kind of mortadella with the clown face, you cut kind of one slice off and you can see that these all kind of point to further, like to systematic kind of muscle, like fibers or something in that way, paths and vectors. And so then if we were to think of other things than cards in a way of cards,
Yes,
then it were also like part of the task, or like possibility, were to turn some aspects of theirs into or like kind of to almost kind of, I don't want to say kind of explode them, but kind of to kind of defragment them, and to take these fragments and attempt to understand them as imprints of a particular systematic thread that finds kind of likeness in other objects along that particular systematics, and then another one that finds likeness with other objects through another kind of systematic, or with other objects also. You understand? I mean, are you still expressing myself? So that would mean that, like, by way of that, I could not only conceive or like kind of try and imagine an object as one that could be, say, added or removed from a scene or organizational imagination or something, but that would also, so to speak, propose possible systematics that I then could go chasing in other elements to kind of find is this right.
Yes, and in many ways, like also in ways that, like, what is like an, say, a systematic area inside every card, but also in a way of what is an element that connects all the cards, like how like the suit is different from a particular area in a card in itself, or what is a deck of the cards. But then you can, in each of these questions, if you think that you can also kind of utilize beyond what a card is, like you could say, okay, I just make up a suit. I saw this image or saw this view on a in a city or inside a building. And for me, that suggested light. And then I made it into a tarot card where I made a title for it and a description. That's like I'm picking tarot card because it's easy systematics. And by that description, this photograph turned into a tarot card. And now I'm looking for other cards in the suite of light. But then by the third card, I've named the suite as light and shadow because it became more interesting. And I come back and kind of reapply that. And maybe this suite only has 4 cards at the end, and another
Very
suite has
interesting.
7.
Yeah.
And there is actually 20 suits, or maybe not. This is kind of navigation possibilities.
Yeah.
Systematic navigation possibilities.
The funny thing is that basically what happens this way is maybe one would say, I would think, a new capacity
Yes.
of cards, which is that they become, or like kind of the application becomes, no, hang on, what does what? It's a generative system in that way.
Yeah, it's a framework that proposes a lot of possibilities for generative systems. It's a meta-generative.
I mean, what I'm trying to say is like a self-generating thing.
Yes.
Because that's what you just described. And
Yeah.
I want to say at this point, and this is, I think, where I can a bit use this also, and I'm not sure that I want to, but I could. But so I was recently, months back, proposing a thesis theme for my studies. And I made a presentation where and in a funny way, so this is, I understand we're talking about something different, but there's also similarities because I chose to make the presentation, because it had to be a video, but I made it as pictures. So there's already this kind of card thing. You throw a thing and it's there, and then it's not there, but it still kind of belongs together.
Yeah.
And you have a selection of stuff numbered or like countable anyway. But the way, because it's very at the beginning of what I'm studying there, and I don't really know what I want to be doing with it, but I'm magnetized to a couple of things also that we have spoken about, where I'm like, I want those to be aspect of this. So I throw them in as cards, and then in the end, I'm being asked, so yeah, but like, what again is the exact question of your thesis, or what form is it going to take? And I'm like, I don't know that. That's not where I know that. But I feel I could use these things that have now been thrown out as kind of, retroactive mirrors in a way to tell me what the systematic is that I spelled out there.
Yeah, like give a suggestion to how to see it as a system in a kind of extended sense.
Yeah. So that's kind of well, it's not quite the same, and maybe I went a bit off track, so then I asked for excuse. But what I was relating to was what you said there, that out of the kind of attempt or the act of perceiving something as a card can come this kind of stretching. I also always want to say,
dimension in the sense of a system, and even choice of dimensions, like following the suite is a different dimension than following, let's say, the title, and like that they kind of like extend themselves like a vortex. Let's say you're in a real life situation, then it's kind of like a vortex that extends from
that's
that same
the word,
view, but a framed vortex, in the sense that the suit is a different frame than, say, the description or a title, and of course could be a lot of other things as well.
And
so
I think
do say. No, do say.
No, I think it's it's interesting, and maybe I'm just getting this now, that like, you remember like last week we spoke about monads,
Mm,
and there's something both universal, but for this moment more relevantly, something very basic, something foundational
mm,
about this idea, this kind of concept of a monad. And we
mm,
criticized, I think, both of those last time,
yeah.
constructively. And now, this time we speak about cards, and the thing that kind of appears is that if they were monads in the way of like scope, like types that kind of allow, so to speak, kind of a self-recognition as this type, which then becomes this generative thing that we spoke about.
Mm.
What they are not is elementary.
No, yeah,
They're not,
the typology. Then,
yeah, but like they're not, so they're not like, we don't, if we say card, we speak about a rather high level object.
mm, yeah,
It's not, it's like there is a physicality thing, which one might, for with any legitimation or not, call then basic, but we really speak about a high level thing that already includes
mm,
suit, text, number, image, these type of things. And we use it kind of as a crutch, right? That's where we are right now.
mm,
We use it as a kind of instrument,
mm.
but we don't bother with the fact that it is already quite high level the moment we begin interacting with it.
I think actually that is a good thing. That
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
high, like,
yeah.
and one of the reasons is, like, I agree with what you're essentially saying. Like, also the high levelness, that it's not an elemental, but it's
No,
actually, that's why it's a kind of complementary structure, because like with the oxel structure, what you can point out that there you can kind of set this almost like a, well, uh, a point, like perspectivistic point, like cautionally called like monadic point, where things organize themselves and therefore kind of create this sort of possibility of reorganizing and reorganizing. Like, I'm not going to repeat everything from the last session, but then comes the question, okay, how do you organize? And this is one of the interesting things about cards, is because they are types of organization.
well,
Right.
and in a sense, the oxel is kind of the blank space. It's just a container spot. It's a kind of storage, like an address, like a
Yeah,
memory
yeah, yeah,
address.
yeah, yes, it is. And but this then starts to offer not totally a full and nowhere near full, but a kind of interesting type or typology of organization. That, okay, you can set these points like oxels, but then what opens from there is also a question of how does it organize? And then this card can be a way to think about the organization and even compose that organization itself.
So
So
there's
that,
two things, I think, in my head anyway, there's now two things, and maybe we find a way through this kind of Takeshi's castle in a non-destructive way, that there can
mm,
be two things also at the end.
mm,
What I looked at was the oxel as being a kind of, point object, empty, no extension,
mm,
just being kind of one among others, into which you can then kind of throw a card. You could also throw in a filter layer.
yeah,
You
yeah,
could also throw in a scene. You could also throw in a
yes,
move. And then they begin kind of possibly kind of coming up with some cookery and doing some stuff.
yeah.
What you said, though, I was just wondering, and maybe that's just kind of like almost like, yeah, well, I'm not going to go there because I think I will fall on my nose. Anyway, it would be a different kind of regime, was that the card might be a helper to organize the oxels.
Oxel is organizing, just like the monad is, by the way. Like the,
Well, it is,
yeah.
I mean, that's where we were, right? Like
Okay, or let's say like this, like monad is kind of puristically organizing. It's merely organizing because it's at a certain point, like city views or like unfurls itself in a certain way because you're at a certain point. But Oxel is different though in the sense that it can propose an organization because it's not about physical location. It's like if I say cinema is a culture of watching uh, like moving images and stopping the film to turn them into tarot cards, and that's cinema. What I'm doing is reorganizing, and that's why it's a new point. It kind of repositions what cinema is, but it's doing that by reorganizing. That's the key thing, and then it immediately comes this question of what kind of tools or arsenals you could have for this organization. And I think that's where the card is complementary in the sense that it's quite close here. It's very much a kind of layer filter, but it also comes with a palette, this sort of meta framework of different things to think about in order to organize. A suit is a form of organization.
So how describe to me, please, the relationship, if you take that kind of this reorganization you just did, executed or performed rather, of the cinema, and the relationship in which you would bring that with the card, or in which you would bring a card with that.
Well, it's if the cinema is an example, and it kind of underlies the capability of reorganizing any point, including new points. Then you come to this question of, but what kind of tools you have for this reorganization? Of course, you can write it out, like that particular thing was just a description. But then what the card offers is this, because the frame of a card is almost like a point in itself. Like it has this sort of similar nodic quality.
Yeah.
But then it offers this sort of possibility of, okay, I am to reorganize from here. What kind of things I could do to organize? And it's certainly not exhaustive what cards offer, but in its framework, it offers a lot of possibilities, including inside the point, like what comes reorganized from there, but also how those points relate to each other in terms of like suit is actually then looking for other cards that are in the suit itself. So it's offering this sort of tools of, okay, here's how you can start to work the reorganization. A particular toolkit, not the only one, but
I think I understood the last part, but I still don't understand how I can kind of somehow join that with the cinema thing that you made, and I'm also not exactly, yeah, that may be the question number one.
Well, like in a way, like the way I described the cinema is actually kind of how to operate it.
So you said, let me just see that I got that. You said, if I say that cinema is basically a culture that is there for movies to be run so that they can be stopped, for me to make cards out of the stopped image. That's what you said, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of reorganizing a little bit what we might now think, what we have until just a second ago thought was the kind of purpose of cinema, and you made that into a new thing on which we now all agree. Yeah. So, or like not.
Or and the players agree, or
well, anybody
who joined the game of that kind of cinema.
Yeah. Whoever just joined that agrees, possibly maybe on that. So now, so by that. First, this is kind of where it gets a little bit kind of twisted into itself. You created a card maker. But like, how do you play that card maker now as a card? So how is this not like a kind of origin story of how to get two cards? But how do you?
I mean, because there is no the origin. Like origins happen. Like it is. I should have picked another example than the cinema, because the confusing part that it generates cards. Although that is an interesting twist in itself.
It's fun, yes.
But, yeah. Like, but the origin can happen in numerous times, like practical.
So I'm not interested in the origin. I am not. So
Yeah.
you did a reorganization. Let's pick any other reorganization. Now comes the card in.
Okay.
Well, basically, I'm asking a question that I don't even need the answer to, because I just suggested that the card comes in and then I can see what happens. So that's also fun. Like, I don't need an explanation because I think we're in a non-foundational space anyway.
I would position it differently. Like when you say the card doesn't necessarily come when I've done the reorganization. It's at the point when I want to reorganize.
Yeah, exactly.
What are my brushes and paints?
Yeah.
And among those brushes and paints is this particularly useful system brush that is the framework of the card.
Yeah. Or
So
it comes after, doesn't matter.
It can
Or
come,
it
can
long
come
before.
after, can come after, certainly. But it's useful in the sense that I want to reorganize this. What could I do? Via the way of cards, I can see possibilities, the kind of possibilities that the framework of the card offers.
Yeah.
And those possibilities also might be easier for people to understand. To give an example of this, because this is a practical example, I tried for one person to explain this sort of like changing the reality tab by putting on top of it something via the kind of layer filter idea. And they sort of got it. But then when I explain it, it's like putting a card on top of this, like in invisible ink that is showing through. And then that seemed to be relatively easier for people to think, or that person to think. And I think the reason is that they kind of understand that cards are put on something. Of course, it was slightly different, but there was a lot of framework they could, inside of them, that they could utilize. But that also came with this possibility to think like, oh, we can remove the card and put another card on it, and so on. And like now we are treating this environment like a game board and putting cards like all of that came quite easily afterwards. And that's not the only range of possibilities, certainly. But that possibility and that kind of easiness is interesting for the want of reorganization as tools.
So, and now another thing, like again, piling on, I think one of the things that has kind of consistently to me been a feature of the conversation we've now been, or that I've now joined for a bit more than a year, I guess, with this group, is that kind of despite the toolbox, like all sorts of things, each time we have begun any conversation, kind of fly off of this whole system that we produce, that then emerge as new capacities to think of organization or reorganization. So in a sense, to some extent, I mean, we have now today what I feel is a rather concentrated session. I don't remember that we've had such a kind of, on point, analytical, in-depth, multi-sided discussion of a specific element. I don't recall we've had that.
Rarely.
Yet, I feel that and that's to me the beauty of it, the purpose of this is almost despite that effort, which is, it's not in the thing we seek to examine, in a sense that once we have examined it well, we have found the thing that we can put in our toolbox to, create reorganization. That also, but I think at the same time, and maybe even more, the kind of act of chopping at it and tracing it and relating it has to me seemed through this whole time to just then generate more things, by way of which to think of stuff, so that the creation of, let's say, a method or whatever it is, or toolbox, like you say, is almost the excuse for the practice of keeping to create that toolbox, which is the real way. of kind of, or like not, I don't want to say real because they're not they're dependent upon one another, like of thinking through reorganization.
Well, 3 short points on this, because practical reality calls I have to leave soon, but
Sure.
but like that's a very important point. Like so to visit that, one of the reasons for this is, I think, the poverty of riches. Like then it's because this is more about the operation than the things that are being operated on, although sometimes those things that are being operated on are there precisely to suggest new operations.
Yes.
But that immediately opens this possibility of taking the operation elsewhere and kind of leaving the object behind, or the objectuality behind.
Yes.
And then that opens always this infinity of infinities, and that creates this poverty of richness, which I think, like actually kind of producing tools takes a certain amount of rigor, which I've been kind of maybe slowly trying to push with this Oxel, and why this session was kind of more set into a topic, because I think it's useful to still, at some point, not stop traveling the infinity, but kind of create focus in the infinity. That's one thing.
Yeah.
But the second thing is, there is a benefit, and this is actually present in some game designs, particularly role-playing, is that you create a structure to go through that structure like a door, to leave the structure behind, but you use the structure to get to a certain point.
Yeah.
And this is a feature that happens quite naturally in role-playing games, to a level that people recognize it to a certain extent. And it's a completely valid way of sometimes using it. It's not like you walk through this doorway to a corridor, but rather you use the doorway to see a specific location, and you enter it into a different place, but now you're not kind of in the door frame anymore.
Yeah.
So that's another quality. And then a third quality is that this is actually behavior that is similar to concepts, words, that we use words to get to thoughts, to leave those words behind, is a similar behavior in itself.
Yeah.
So what comes out of this is both the sense that actually this sort of using doorways to get to operations is a very valid, and sometimes even the better choice, so to speak. But at the same time, I do think practically we are precisely in a kind of sometimes poverty of richness situation, that we have opened so many doorways and so many worlds way beyond those, that it's almost like it's a willful act to bring some focus, because one could keep on traveling endlessly. But I think we have traveled, like we have so much experience of these travels, that if we now condense something, or at least experiment with condensing something, that will have a lot of sophistication packed into it. So for me, it's an interesting to maybe push the kind of condensation focus a little bit, in order to see what comes out of it.
Yeah. And if
So,
your time still allows, I would like to respond to that.
Sure.
Because I said this first because I have a kind of personal background in some practices that that speak very much toward like methodology. Not that I could ever identify really with it. And I really think it's a problem in the kind of, as you explained, like to get to a tool and to make a tool in order to pass beyond that tool. That's the way that I can very, very much understand. And that really seems to kind of vibe with what's happening here. But I had to say this because there's like, there's this kind of assumption of a possibility of full methodologization. Is that a word? Like methodization or what? And that's an issue for me. And I just want to kind of confirm or like affirm from my side what you said, that the kind of the intricacy of building the thing is what's going to, I perceive as it what springs then what can spring to other things. And I think this is maybe another point, like kind of non-destructive pathway to travel, that these are indeed dependent upon one another rather than like, tradable in against each other.
Yeah. And also, like, I still think language is one of the better examples, because language is a full methodology, which is like semi-rigorous in its nature. Like, there is looseness to it, but it's quite rigorous. But the whole methodology in itself is also a tool to kind of like go through it rather than stick to it in a way. And I do think this quality is, on principle, for me, an important quality in terms of methodologies. People often think like, okay, I'll take this methodology. That means that I always do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, always following the same recipe. But no, it's like a food recipe can be a way for you to learn about certain tastes, and then you make your own things. Like that quality of practice is not in the methodology. It's more people's attitude and approach to methodology.
Yeah, nice.
But yes, so with that, I will, in the interest and shackles of time, I will stop sharing. Let's see, reboot the camera, say goodbye, and apologies that we don't have a summary because we don't have a time. I'll maybe try to produce one in text, and say a lot of thank yous, because I think it was a good session. Like, it was good to have this end, because this also brought this larger connection of this card issue to this larger endeavor.
Yeah, and it makes new spaces for other structures to be kind of maybe looked at in the same kind of anatomical examination here.
Yes.
Nice.
So thanks for that, and see you surprisingly soon.
Very soon, indeed. Yes. Have a nice 1.5 days until then.
Yes, and now